Thank you for tuning into this talk. I'm Chris McCullough, a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Entomology working in the Kuhar Vegetable Pest Management Lab. And today I'm going to talk to you about enhancing ecosystem services and crop production. This was part of the research I did while in the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences as a graduate student with Gina Angelello and Megan O'Rourke. So this isn't necessarily a talk about a specific production practice or a pest, but rather kind of the challenge that agriculture faces in needing to grow and needing to produce more for the world while maintaining some environmental quality. And some of the solutions could meet one problem, but not the other. So converting natural land for production or increasing external inputs on land already in production can help produce more, but come with an environmental cost. But one kind of idea or paradigm, ecological intensification, tries to manage both. And that we can increase production on land being currently used for production while minimizing external inputs by enhancing naturally occurring ecosystem services. So how do we think about enhancing ecosystem services? We typically think about it at two scales. The farm scale, which are things like crop production practices, are now a very well studied one as wildflower plantings, and then the landscape scale, which is more or less just trying to preserve natural habitat across the landscape. And there are many ecosystem services we could look at to try and enhance production, but the three we're going to talk about today are biological control of pests, pest regulation, just kind of regulating the population, and yield. So the question in mind today is, what effects does semi-natural habitat have on ecosystem services? So we did a study over 2 years in 2017, 2018 on the Eastern Shore at 22 sites. And around each of these sites, we calculated the amount of semi-natural habitat in three buffer sizes, 1 kilometer, 500 meter, and 250 meters. What semi-natural habitat is basically anything that's not used for production or kind of classified as urban. And we use 4 crops as our model systems: collards, tomatoes, strawberries, and squash. And these crops are grown in bins because we're really trying to see if this would just work as kind of like a proof of concept of saying, if we don't consider the things that are happening at these fields and just look at the plants themselves, what are we observing? So we measured a lot of ecosystem services, 30 in total, but to save time, we're just going to talk about a few today. So we have egg predation of cabbage looper and brown marmorated stink bug, which is just a measure of biological control; pest abundance for the imported cabbage worm and hornworms; pest damage on all 4 of our crops, so chewing damage on collards, piercing sucking damage on tomatoes, Drosophila fruit fly infestation of strawberries, and squash vine borer damage to squash. And then for yield, I'm going to talk about the yield, how we measured it. And this yield measure is in terms of quality versus quantity. So it's the proportion of number of grade 1 harvested items. And we found better results by using quality versus quantity, because quantity was variable across all of our fields. An important thing to note here is each of these ones should feed into the next. So egg predation, if you have high levels of that, should feed into pest abundance, reducing that, which would reduce pest damage, which should, in theory, increase yield. So we'll look at our results now. Our first one here is egg predation. On the left, we have cabbage looper. On the right, brown marmorated stink bug. The amount of eggs predated on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis is the best scale analyzed, but for both cabbage looper and brown marmorated stink bug at 250 meters and 500 meters respectively, we didn't see any effect of semi-natural habitat on egg predation. Moving on to pest abundance, whoopsies. We have imported cabbage worm on the left, hornworms on the right, the number of larvae per plant on the y-axis. And again, we did not see an effect for either imported cabbage worm or hornworms. Moving on to pest damage, though, we did find some significant effects. So on the top left, we have chewing damage on collards. Top right, piercing sucking damage on tomatoes. Bottom left is squash vine borer damage on squash, and bottom right is Drosophila infested strawberries. So for chewing damage on collards, we saw a significant effect at the 250 meter scale as that amount of semi-natural habitat increased, chewing damage decreased. We saw the same thing for the piercing sucking damage on tomatoes, except this was at the 500 meter scale instead of the 250 meter scale. Now on the bottom left for squash vine borer at the 1000 meter scale, unfortunately we saw an increase in damage as the amount of semi-natural habitat increase. And then finally for Drosophila and strawberries, we saw no effects. But lastly now here for these slides with graphs, we have our yield graph. And for all 4 of the crops, collards top left, tomato top right, squash bottom left, strawberries bottom right, we saw a significant effect of the amount of semi-natural habitat in the landscape at the 250 meter scale. So for all 4 of these crops, as that amount of semi-natural habitat increased at that scale, so did the amount of high quality yield. So basically more natural habitat meant we harvested more grade 1 items from what we grew. So that's a pretty astounding result, also considering these are four crops that aren't related to each other. So basically to summarize all that, maintaining semi-natural habitat on a larger scale can benefit crop production by enhancing the quality of what's being grown. However, it does come with the caveat of that to really truly say that more strongly, we'll have to kind of scale that up to see what effects happen. And also we'd have to probably take our crops out of the bins and grow them in the ground to have them interact with more of a field setting. This was kind of like a laboratory experiment in the field, but it is very exciting to see that this kind of proof of concept that it did work and affected yield. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. I'd also like to thank the people who helped us gather all this data and let us use their fields. If you have questions or comments, feel free to email me at the address below. Thank you for your time.